In the 16th chapter of Matthew, there's a fascinating little interchange between Jesus and his disciples, which, when you read it from our modern perspective, certain questions don't occur to you that I have little questions did occur to them. And I've often wondered, as people heard some of the things that Jesus said, what the people thought who heard it. We have all the gospel accounts to read to think about, and we have then Luke's account in the book of Acts. We have all of Paul's epistles. We have so much information and history behind us, and of course our own preconceptions that cause us to look at it a certain way. These people had nothing of the New Testament. They had Jesus, who was standing in front of them, making this statement. And you'd wonder, as I say, how they sometimes thought about this. For example, in Matthew the 16th chapter, and in verse 18, that famous saying, "But I say unto you that thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Now, at this point in time, did they know what a church was? I mean, nobody's even talked about a church. There was no church because Jesus was going to build a church. Oh, I know that we have a concept of the Old Testament church, or the assembly. But one does wonder, when Jesus stood before the men and said, "Now, you are Peter," using one word, but then he said, "Upon this Petra, I will build my assembly." I'll construct or build the edifice of my assembly. What did they think that he was talking about? The word church that we use today is hardly related to the Greek word translated here as church, which is, again, the ecclesia, or assembly of God's people. Well, this comes in a context that goes back, well, quite a ways. I'm only going to take you back to verse 13 and read it and think about the implications of what we read for the statement that was made. When Jesus came to the coast of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" And they said, "Well, some say you're John the Baptist, some people say Elijah, some say Jeremiah, other people said, well, he's one of the prophets." He says, "But who do you say that I am?" And Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." There it was. The words were out. The thing that was on everybody's mind, the thing that they all were expecting and thinking about, is this individual that we're seeing here, listening to, watching, following, is he really the Messiah? John the Baptist had asked the question, are you he that is to come, or shall we look for another? And Jesus sent his reply to him. But there had been long in this time an expectation that the Messiah was coming. In fact, the messianic fervor was at a very high level among these people at this time. Along comes someone performing miracles. As a teacher, the question is the most natural one in the world. And finally, Jesus put the question to them. "What do men say that I am?" And they answered, "Who do you think I am?" Peter answered very straightforward, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father which is in heaven. And I say unto you that you are Petros, and upon this Petra, this other rock, I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." Now, the idea of the Messiah building his assembly is not as foreign as you might think. For the very idea of the Messiah is that he would come to lead Israel, that he would, and almost anybody's belief at the time, was a Savior, that he was one who would deliver them from captivity, one who would restore the kingdom, that he would once again establish this in Israel. And so, since Israel of old had been called the congregation, or the assembly of God, that the tabernacle is called the tent of meeting, or the tent of assembly, and the whole idea of that is conveyed in the word assembly, which is translated as church in our Bible, was a very old idea among these people. So it may not have sounded so terribly strange to them to hear him say, "Okay, you said I am the Messiah. That's good. God's revealed that to you. And I say to you, upon this rock I will build my assembly, my congregation." So he was going to do this. He says, I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Not merely to Peter, because as we'll see later, he gave it to more than just Peter. But I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. And then he charged his disciples that they should tell no man that he was the Messiah. Now, all this stuff that we read here is very related to this question of the building of or the creation of an assembly. First of all, the confession that he was the Messiah, that as the Messiah he was going to build his assembly. And then following that, he said, I am going to give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, we have preached over and over and over again about the meaning behind some of these scriptures, and I'm not going to address them at this time. But you have to understand this question of binding and loosing in keys in connection with his statement that I am going to build my assembly. In other words, it is the assembly of the Messiah, his group, and that this decision or this authority that was granted to his disciples, to his ministry, as it were, to his apostles, was an administrative authority where that assembly was concerned. The binding and loosing decisions that had to be made relative to that assembly. I think it's important to understand that. Now, what is this assembly? Why is it? Where is it? The Messiah's assembly, as we find it in the New Testament, exists at several levels. The word ecclesia or assembly is used again and again and again throughout the New Testament, and there are three broad ways, and more probably besides this if we really want to get technical about it. There is, of course, the local assembly, a little local church, which is probably the easiest to see, comprehend, or grasp of all the forms or modes of existence of the church of God. For indeed, you walk in the door here is an assembly of people. It's an assembly of people that operate in a certain consistent way. We have a set mode of service each week. We have hymns, an opening prayer. We have announcements. We have a sermon. Prior to this time, we have a Bible study. It's an assembly that is formalized in rules and methods of doing things and ways of going about doing things. We even heard an announcement of the fact that there is a local church council which takes care of the business of the local assembly. That is, the things that we as a group of people try to do together, this little assembly takes care of. So this is what you see is the way a church can function at a local level. There is something else that I'm going to call today the administrated church or assembly. And by that I mean whatever structured administration that exists to encompass the church in one or more of its local congregations. In our particular case, the administrated church finds its form in a thing called the Church of God International, a Texas nonprofit corporation. In other words, it is one church out of which there are many local congregations, each of which functions in its own little way to do the things that have to be done in that local congregation. But then there is an administration over all that church, which again has a set of rules, an administration, a way of doing business, a way in which we're doing things, a statement of goals where the fundamental goals of the church, what they have to be, are taken and developed into the methodology that we're going to use to accomplish those goals, and how all of us are going to work that out and work together. That's what I would call the administrated church. Now turn back to Hebrews, if you will, for the third one that we're going to talk about, in the 12th chapter of the book of Hebrews. It's called something rather different here, and this is the one that in some ways is hardest to see, but it is of all these modes of existence of the assembly of the Messiah, the most important. Hebrews, the 12th chapter, and I'll begin reading in verse 22. There's much that goes before this. I'm cutting in the middle of a thought. But you are come unto Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. You are come to the general assembly and church of the firstborn who are written in heaven, and to God the judge of all, and to the spirits of just men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the blood of sprinkling that speaks better things than that of Abel. See that you refuse not him that speaks, for if they did not escape who refused him that spoke upon the earth, how much more shall we not escape if we turn away from him that speaks from heaven? Now, this expression, you are come to to the general assembly and church of the firstborn written in heaven. Notice the word assembly and the word church. Now, what is it saying? Does it say the assembly and the assembly? Actually, it does not. The word translated church in your King James Version here is the Greek word ecclesia, or assembly. The other word, translated here as assembly from the Greek, basically means a mass meeting. It's the word, it has the word pan, which is from the Greek means all, or all-encompassing. He actually speaks of a mass meeting and church. That is the assembly of all the firstborn who are written in heaven. And so the church exists at a level that is above the local level, above the level of some administrative structure that exists of the church. Far above all of that exists something called the General Assembly and Church of the firstborn who are written in heaven. That one is, this is the church undivided, if you will. It's undivided in time. In this sense, you and I are one with Peter and James and John and Paul and Trophimus and all those people who did the work and carried on, whose names you find written in the New Testament. We are members of the same church with those people because this is the church undivided by time. This is the church that is undivided by location or by space. That merely because we are here and the Memphis church is over there, we are one with those people. That merely because we are here and another church is in Pasadena, California, or another church is in Chicago, Illinois, or one is meeting down in Houston, that this is the church undivided by space. This is the church undivided by ideology, oddly enough. This means that we are of one with people who meet in other places whom we do not even know and of whose existence we are ignorant. There are people in this world who have God's Spirit, who exist in some sort of an administrative church or organization, be it local or be it more, which we have never heard of, don't know of, and yet who have a relationship with God and are part of the General Assembly and Church of the firstborn. I'll never forget, Oliver, how we all felt in Pasadena many years ago. We were sitting around thinking that we were all there was for the Church of God. We were the only ones anyway that ever kept the holy days, and we had the truth and the Sabbath, the holy days, and all this kind of stuff, and that's all there was. There was no more church. I believe it was Robert Flores who was working in South America at the time, made his way into Argentina, and by chance would have it, came across a group of people called the Israelite Church of the New Covenant. These people, all of them Argentinians, Spanish-speaking Argentinians, observed the Sabbath. They observed clean and unclean meats as we did. They had virtually all the same customs and laws. They observed the holy days as we did. They only had this one small point that they were in error on. They kept Pentecost on Sunday instead of on Monday. And see, some of you are laughing. Those of you who don't know what the joke is on that, ask one of those people who are laughing. They'll explain it to you later on. Of course, the truth is that we were the ones that were wrong. They were the ones that were right. And it was interesting that we found these people who they had learned none of what they learned from us. Now, they had their history, and there was a man who had come down there from Pennsylvania in the last century and had started that church down there. And no one, as far as I know, has been able to connect this man with any of the Sabbath-keeping organizations of which we are aware or know about. The Church of God Seventh Day, the Seventh-day Adventists, all the varieties of Church of God Seventh Day and Seventh-day Baptist. He is not found in the records of any of these people. Who was this person? Where did he come from? How did this happen? How could this happen? Oh, it's easy how it could happen. It could happen just like the Apostle Paul, who was struck down the road to Damascus and went away and was taught by Christ and was sent back to teach these people. For all we know, they don't know. All they know is the name of the man and know where he came from. But it's interesting that at any point in time, there can be people of whom you are absolutely unaware, who are unknown to a given administration, who are a part of the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn written in heaven. You can't see it, but it is there. Then there is the church that you can see. And this kind of takes form in the local church. You can see this one right here. And the administrative church, which kind of exists on paper and in interactions, and you can see it more at the Feast of Tabernacles. The work of the administrative church is really simple enough. You turn back with me to Matthew, the 28th chapter. I want to discuss with you just for a moment how it works, how what I'm calling today, for want of a better term, the administrative church, or a church organization, or the organized church, as it were, comes to exist. In Matthew the 28th chapter is the Great Commission, where Jesus told his disciples what exactly it was that they were supposed to do. Now, at this particular moment in time, there weren't very many disciples. We think there were about 120 that existed this time, although we do know there were 500 that had seen Jesus alive after his resurrection. There were 120 apparently of a very tight group of disciples that existed and were the ones who were doing the work at this time. But here we are, and some of the last words that Jesus gave to his disciples, his apostles in particular, before his departure. He said in Matthew 28, verse 19, "Go ye therefore, and teach all nations." We know that the word teach should mean make disciples of, or disciple all nations. It isn't just a matter of teaching, but the creation of disciples, baptizing them in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatsoever I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the ends of the world. Now, what could be simpler than that? At a personal level, it's easy enough. You know, you're supposed to go and make disciples. Well, there are a lot of ways that can be done. Herbert Armstrong went on the air the first Sunday in January 1934 with radio and began just preaching the Bible. Preaching out of prophecy, preaching out of the gospel accounts, preaching, you know, those things in the Bible that were different from what people thought they said, catching people's interest, stimulating their Bible study, telling them, don't believe me, believe what you see in your Bible. And the very natural result of preaching the gospel in this way is you make disciples out of people who weren't. They weren't Bible readers, now they are. They weren't interested in what God was doing, now they are. You have made a disciple. And so after that, he had to follow up because they wrote to him and they wanted more information and they wanted to be baptized. And so he actually had to, you know, many years ago, get in his car and drive off across country and himself baptize many of those people who wrote in response to his radio broadcast. Many of you know the story that followed over the years as that's been done. Now, that's one way of doing it. Other preachers had gone into town, put up a tent, got up in front of them, and began to get this word out here and began to preach. I've actually wandered around in England near Hyde Park, on Hyde Park Corner. You can go there any day almost, certainly on the weekends and Sundays, and go around and find somebody on a box with a group of people around him with a Bible in his hand, preaching out of the Bible. Not at all unlike, I suspect, what the Apostle Paul did when he took out across Asia Minor, and as he went to a synagogue and spoke because he was welcome there, and after he got thrown out of the synagogue, well, he spoke to the people who gathered with him after that. Whatever forum, whatever place, whatever opportunity there was, he spoke. He made disciples. As God says, it is by the foolishness of preaching that he will save those who believe. Oftentimes that making of disciples took place at a very personal level, as Priscilla and Aquila would take someone in hand and began to speak to them about the Christ and about what Christ had done. And then as a result of the work that they did, that person would be baptized. It would be like Philip, who encountered the Ethiopian eunuch and saw him coming along reading his Bible. He said, "What are you reading?" He said, "Well, I'm reading the book of Isaiah." "Do you understand what you read?" "Well, no, I don't. How could I, except some man should teach me?" And so Philip climbed up in his chariot and began to explain the Bible to him. And they walked along. Here's a pool of water. And the Ethiopian eunuch says, "Hey, here's water. What hinders me to be baptized?" And so the second step was taken after he had made a disciple out of the man, baptized him. And then the third thing, the task that was given, was to teach them to do the things that I have commanded you. The setting in of the systematic teaching of God's Word. This is a relatively easy thing for us to understand, and the result of doing this thing creates, by just natural, the most natural flow of events that you can imagine, creates an assembly of people. One of the more interesting aspects of this is found back in the second chapter of the book of Acts. It's a good illustration of the way in which the whole thing worked. Now, in this chapter of the Bible, the disciples had gathered together on the day of Pentecost. They were there observing the day of Pentecost. No doubt they were all Jews. It would never occur to them not to. And as they were sitting in a room together, the whole place was filled with a roar like a tornado. There was a flickering fire that came in across the ceiling of the room, and then a distributed little tongue of fire went down on each one of the people sitting in there. And they began to speak with other languages. And so here they go out into the area around the temple, and they are speaking in other languages the wonderful works of God. And there are people who understand those languages all over the place in here because it's Pentecost. And so each of them begins to gather his own little group, because the people who understood Parthian would go listen to the guy who was speaking Parthian. And the people who understand the Egyptian dialects would be over listening to this fellow. And they were preaching away. And finally, a rather good crowd got gathered around, and they all began to make jokes, saying, well, they must be drunk, must be something going on. And finally, Peter took the dominant position here and began to speak to all these people to explain to them what was going on. His sermon is here. I won't read it all to you today because it's interesting enough in itself. But what is of singular interest is the result. That when Peter had finally come around to the convicting statement in his sermon, in verse 37, we're told that when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart, and they said to Peter and the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? Peter said, repent and be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Jesus Christ for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Holy Spirit. For the promise is to you and to your children and to every one that's afar off, as many as the Lord our God shall call. With many other words he did testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation. Then they that gladly received his word were baptized, and the same day there were added them about 3,000 souls. Now, how do you suppose they handled these 3,000 souls? How many people can we get in this room? How many people could assemble here in this room and worship together and sing hymns and pray and be edified by a sermon being given in this room? What do we get? Reckon 600, 700 if we worked them up at the balconies and standing room only and around the edges? Maybe 600 or 700. They baptized 3,000 people in one day. Do you imagine they didn't baptize anybody the next day? Or the day after that? How many people were there in this church by the time a week or a month or a few months or a few years had gone by? Well, there's very little doubt that this became a very, very significant congregation of people in Jerusalem in very short order. Did they then have one local church of 3,000? No. No, it was not manageable to do that. It didn't make any sense. And history, in fact, tells us, it suggests that there were many synagogue-like churches that existed in and around Jerusalem in the first century. I have very little doubt that, in judging from the things you read a little bit of in the Bible, there were many churches that existed, not only in Jerusalem but other cities as well. They seem to be presented to us as though it was the church in Jerusalem. But obviously there were many little local congregations. They were, however, administered churches. In other words, it was one church. It was not many. They weren't looked upon as being, an apostle of Jerusalem East, or this is the elder from Jerusalem West, Jerusalem North, Jerusalem Central, Temple Mount, Wailing Wall, West, all the different places that they could put little churches or synagogues or meeting places. The church met in people's homes. They gathered for prayer. They went to the temple for prayer. They then got together to break bread for fellowship in individual homes all over the place. They were local churches here and there, I suppose, or assemblies in someone's house, but they were a church that was administered by the 12 apostles, by the elders, and by apparently a council of elders that had to do with the entire Jerusalem area. Now, administrative problems rose very early in all of this. You begin to realize that as soon as you get this large group of people together, that any idea of doing things, the normal things that you do as a community of people, become a problem very quickly. That there has to be some realization for field churches. And I think you can be very little doubt that they had, at least informally, and soon they had to develop formal structure in order to take care of the simplest little things that they had to do. For example, in the early church in Jerusalem, there were widows who had no income. In fact, that was almost a redundancy to say that. If you were a widow in those times, you didn't have any income. There was no Social Security. There was no welfare. There was a third tithe barn where the poor could go and get food if they needed it. But there was nothing like what we have today. And so consequently, if you're elderly, you're a widow, or you're even a younger widow with children whose father is dead, you have a problem unless somebody takes care of you or sees to your needs or wants to help you You're going to be in desperate straits very shortly. So here we are with 3,000 people in the church in one day. How many of those 3,000 people were widows? How many of them were widows who had children that they couldn't properly take care of? Oh, there were no doubt quite a lot of them. And so immediately, people were taking steps. I mean, for one thing, they all wanted to stay in Jerusalem. They were selling properties and land and distributing money equally among themselves so that they all could stay there longer. They were making all kinds of very unselfish decisions in order to share the experience that they were enjoying at that time. The problem is that without some rules, that this thing would become very inequitable. I mean, it would have just like a soup with lumps in it. You know, the thing hasn't been stirred right. So consequently, the complaint is raised in chapter 6, verse 1. In those days, when the number of disciples was multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily administration. So the 12 called the multitude of disciples to them and said, now, it doesn't make sense that we should leave the Word of God and serve tables. Now, basically, I don't think he meant putting the plate on the table. That's not his point. The point is that there was an organization, an organized administration called for here that had to do with some physical aspects of carrying on the work of the church, that it didn't make sense to them who had the ministry of the Word to be spending their time in a ministry to the needs of people. I really think that's what he's talking about here. Wherefore, brethren, look out from among you 7 men of honest report, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we'll give ourselves to the ministry of the Word and the prayer. Okay, a division of labor. Simple division of labor. Tell me, where did they get the authority to do that? Where in all of Christ's teachings is there an instruction for them as to how they're supposed to structure this local church or this administered group of local churches that existed in Jerusalem at that time? There's nothing there. There's nothing in all of Christ's teachings. There are no instructions he ever gave them, nothing whatsoever. I suppose he must have assumed that with his Spirit they were smart enough to figure out how to handle their administrative problems and needs. You suppose it's possible that Jesus said, why should I explain to these fellows how to take care of the widows in the church? Isn't it enough for me to tell them to take care of them? You figure out how to do it. You determine how you're going to go about it. So they sat down and they talked it over. They used reason to arrive at certain conclusions. We have a task to do. Here are our resources. Here's the manpower. How are we going to best administer this? So they picked 7 qualified men and set them over it and delegated that to them and walked away from it and left it alone. In other words, it was a delegation of responsibility which they had, obviously, the right to do. Now, it's interesting that as time passed in the early church, there is the implicit development of some organizational or rather administrative units that come along. Turn back to the 14th chapter of Acts, and I'll show you what I mean. Acts chapter 14, and I'll begin reading in verse 21. I think I'm in the wrong place. Yes, I am in the wrong place. Chapter 14, verse 21 is right. I just wasn't at chapter 14, verse 21. When they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. Now, first of all, let me bring you up to speed on this. They had left Antioch of Syria some time ago on the what's called Paul's first missionary journey. Most of you who have maps in the back of your Bible will have one that says Paul's first missionary journeys, and it will have a code that shows you which one's the first, which is the second, which is the third. Well, this is the one where he goes across to Cyprus, then goes up into Turkey, and makes his way through Pisidian Antioch, and then the churches of Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium, preaching everywhere. It's where he was stoned and left for dead. It's where one city they were going to try to make a god out of him. He and Barnabas were Jupiter and Mercury, and they were going to do sacrifice to them. This is the area that they had just gone through, preaching the gospel. Okay, they've gone through and done their job. It says they confirmed the souls of the disciples and exhorted them to continue in the faith, and that we must, through much tribulation, enter the kingdom of God. And when they had ordained them elders in every church, and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. What Paul has done here is to assume, Paul and Barnabas, to assume an administrative authority where this particular set of churches is. This is, by the way, the region of Galatia. And so when you read the epistle to the Galatians, it is this set of churches that he is writing to over the things that have taken place and over all of his concerns. So Paul, in an administrative sense, is responsible for these churches. He appointed the elders that existed in each of them. That's what the word ordain means, is to appoint. He appointed their elders. He had been the one who had raised them up. He was the one they looked to. Paul is the one who had the moral authority to instruct, to correct, to teach. And so when things went wrong, it was Paul who had the responsibility for writing them a letter to them, saying to you, "O foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you that you should not obey the truth?" And so you do see the slow development of certain administrative areas of responsibility or administrations within the church. The 15th chapter of Acts is interesting in this regard too, because here a dispute arises over some people who come from Jerusalem to Antioch, and they come up with this doctrinal idea that you have to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses in order to be saved. And the question even rises as to whether a person who can be called a Gentile can even be a part of God's community or the community of faith. Quite an interesting question that gets raised. Paul didn't realize there should be any question. I mean, he had seen the evidence of God working with Gentiles who were uncircumcised all over the place. He had seen God give his Holy Spirit to uncircumcised Gentiles. He had no question. So people from Jerusalem, from what amounted to almost like another administrative unit of the church, came up to make an issue out of this question. Well, they didn't just throw them out in the street. They got together and went down to Jerusalem to talk to the apostles and elders about the matter. And they went round and round in Jerusalem, discussed the whole thing, and came to a conclusion. Again, that's another thing that's been discussed at great length elsewhere. It's not my purpose to discuss that today, except to notice one factor as we get toward the end of the book of Acts. Actually, it's really in Paul's letter to the Galatians when he discusses what happens here that is explained. He said that they gave me the right hand of fellowship, that I should go to the Gentiles and that they would go to Israel. There was, in a sense, a division of administrative responsibility that took place in Jerusalem. They shook hands on it, that basically Paul was responsible for it. Now, you see some interesting developments as you read through Paul's epistles. You have to realize that based upon, historical knowledge of the time, that these local churches on a week-to-week basis paddled their own canoes. They had to. There was no telex. They couldn't get a fax from Paul. They couldn't jerk the phone off the hook and call him up. I mean, it would be months, weeks. They could send a letter, and who knows how long it would be before it came back. And a letter goes out, and a letter comes back, and you've still only got a letter. You don't have an administrator on the spot making decisions. So by and large, the early church functioned as an autonomous church at the local level for the most part. And yet, when you read Paul's epistles, it's very, very clear that he is like a father to these churches. I say like a father. You don't call any man on earth your father. That he has enormous authority with them. He writes to one and says, "What do you want? You want me to come with a rod or in a spirit of meekness?" Now, try telling that, if you're Billy Graham, tell that to the First Baptist Church of Tyler, Texas. Well, you want me to come down there with a rod? Billy Graham has no authority there. He may have some influence because they like him, but he has no authority there. Paul carried authority in Corinth. Paul carried authority in Rome. Paul carried authority throughout Galatia. I mean, there were people who fought him on it, but nevertheless, he did carry it. But it was a moral authority, and it was a very loose structure that all this came to. Now, the question is about when we come back to the question of these little administrative units, administrative decisions, the way they arrived at their decision in the Jerusalem conference, our decision is this, that we trouble not the Gentiles and so forth. Where did they get the authority for all this? Well, you remember I already read it to you back in Matthew the 16th chapter. I will give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose upon earth shall be loosed in heaven. I want you to turn back close to that, to Matthew the 18th chapter, because here the thing is reiterated. Some people seem to have the idea that in Matthew 16, Jesus is talking to Peter and grants to him this keys of the kingdom, whatever that is. But the fact is that he was talking to all of them, and it's very clear in chapter 18, which is where I want you to go now. Chapter 18 and verse 15. Moreover, if your brother shall trespass against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he will hear you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear you, take with you one or two more, that in the mouth of two or three witnesses every word may be established. And if you neglect to hear them, then tell it to the church. Now, the presumption here is that there's some sort of an administrative structure that can hear this kind of thing, right? In other words, there's a set of rules. There are some expectations involved in this. I mean, what do you mean tell it to the church? The church sits there and hears all of it. Oh, my goodness. Well, that's terrible. I mean, you're telling it to the church. Isn't the church expected to do something about it according to some kind of standards or rules or laws or teaching? Well, of course they are. Listen to this as it continues. Tell it to the church. If you won't hear the church, in other words, the church has a right to speak or to rebuke, and there has to be some sort of an administrative structure, authority, or what have you, a set of rules, as it were, that you go by as to how you handle it. If you won't hear the church, let him be to you as a heathen man and a publican. Verily I say unto you, whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. There is a responsibility for making decisions in these administrative organizational structures that Christ commits to the leadership of the church. It's just as simple as that. They had to make a decision as to how to work out a question, an organizational structure for taking care of a bunch of widows in the church. And so consequently, if two of you folks can't get along and are fighting about something, then there is a responsibility, or there's a way in which the church can go about resolving that kind of difficulty. Paul wrote to the Corinthians, says, what are you people doing over there? I hear that you've got a dispute with this guy over here, and you people have gone to court. Isn't there any way in the church that you can solve that kind of difficulty? You're supposed to be able to have some sort of organizational or administrative structure that can handle that kind of difficulty in the church and keep you out of the courts. Hopefully. Notice Paul's letter presumes an administration in a local church that can deal with this kind of thing and chastises them because they haven't done it. He then says, again I say unto you, if two of you shall agree on earth as touching anything they shall ask, it shall be done of them of my Father in heaven. Now, he's not talking, folks, about you and I getting together and praying, agreeing together to pray that it will rain tomorrow morning and the promise that he's going to have it rain on us tomorrow. That's not what this is about. What this is about is the fact that when the time comes for administrative decisions to be made on disputes between two people or the way in which the church is going to do business, that when two or three, not just one, not unilaterally, but when two or three of those people who are responsible are together and they make an official decision that has to do with the way things are going to be done, he says, I'm there. My stamp of authority is on it. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Whatsoever you shall loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. What this is really telling us is that there is no way to create a set of laws or rules that will foresee or answer all questions. And so therefore, any time that there is an assembly of God's people, be it a local church, be it an organization of churches or of a broader administered church, whatever it is in whatever way that we are going to try to function, there is going to have to be an administration of some kind required. Even back in the Old Testament, we'll turn back to Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 8. There is a full recognition that there are going to be questions that arise. Sometimes there may be questions of liability. You know, I have done something or I have neglected something and you got hurt because I neglected it and you want restitution for it. It can be any number of questions, any number of things that can arise theologically, questions in equity, questions of tort. There was a way of handling it. If there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and get up to the place which the Lord your God shall choose. You shall come to the priests, the Levites, and the judge that shall be in those days and inquire. And they will show you the sentence of judgment. Now notice, having gone to them for your decision, he says, you shall do according to the sentence which they of that place, which the Lord shall choose, shall show you. You shall observe to do all that they inform you, according to the sentence of the law which they will teach you, and according to the judgment which they shall tell you, you shall do. You shall not decline from the sentence that they will show you to the right hand, nor to the left. The man that will do presumptuously and will not listen to the priest that stands to minister there before the Lord, or to the judge, even that man shall die, and you shall put away evil from among Israel. And the people shall hear and fear and do no more presumptuously. You realize that what he is saying here is almost the same thing Jesus said to the disciples? Whatsoever you bind upon earth shall be bound in heaven. And the man that disobeys the decision that's rendered by the legitimate court that will be established will be as though he disobeyed God directly. I will back up that court, is essentially what God says. And so consequently, Old Testament, New Testament, that wherever there is the official assembly of God's people, there will always have to be an administration. There will always have to be bylaws of sorts. And how do we handle these problems and this way of working among our own people in this time and this place? Because times change, circumstances change, people change. For example, you couldn't have, down through all generations, one method of carrying out church services. In the first century, when there were no Bibles to speak of, except, one congregation might have one copy of a scroll of the law or one copy of Matthew's epistle, and many of the people in the congregation did not read, great amounts of Sabbath service time were dedicated to the reading of God's Word. The law was read. If they had an epistle from an apostle, they read that epistle in church, because there was no other way of hearing the Scriptures. So the structure of church in those days was very different today, where you have your own Bible and can read it at home. Presumably you do. And on the other, of course, there is the other side of that story. We might be a whole lot better off today if we did devote some of our time to the reading of the Scriptures, because of the fact that some of us don't read them at home. But that's another subject for another day. But the truth is that for us to do things together, there is a necessity of someone coming along and evaluating the decisions and questions that have to be raised and making decisions on them. One of the easiest, I think, illustrations of this is the simple matter of the time in which we're all going to get together to observe the Feast of Trumpets, or Passover, or Pentecost, or whatever else it may be that we're going to do as far as the calendar of holy days throughout the year is concerned. I will tell you this, there are more questions that could be raised about the calendar than you and I could ever answer in a lifetime. And that whenever you answer one set of questions relative to the calendar, you raise another set of questions relative to the calendar. Now, recently I was discussing with one of the ministers a question that he had raised about the postponements. If you're not familiar with this, don't worry too much about it. Just think about it in terms of principle that exist in the calendar, the Hebrew calendar, as it's presently published by the Spears Comprehensive Hebrew Calendar, the calendar that the Jews follow in working their way through the year. They have a set of rules that they follow in establishing the calendar. The rules focus on the Feast of Trumpets, the new moon of the Feast of Trumpets, and the way in which that new moon is determined. And then they work back and forward throughout the year to establish all the other months and consequently the holy days from that one day. Well, the argument that is oftentimes raised is the Jews have a set of rules that involve postponing the official day, first day of the month, either one day after the conjunction, or in some cases it can even go 2 days after the conjunction, depending upon what time of day the conjunction falls and all this kind of stuff. And the argument was, well, those are man-made rules. Those man-made rules should be put aside, and we should observe the new moon on the feast, on the day of the conjunction, when the moon passes the sun in the sky. You never see that. If the moon is too close to the sun, the only time you'll see it is if there is an eclipse. Then you know. An eclipse is a perfect passing in conjunction of the sun and the moon. That will always be a conjunction. Okay. The question then is raised in this, well, then we should do away with that. I told him, I said, we could do that, get our almanacs out and determine what the new moons are for the years to come. I said, but as sure as we do that, and as soon as we publish that this is what we're going to do, I will then have a set of papers coming in the very next month, and they will continue for the whole next year, from people who argue with me to the effect that no. The day of the conjunction is not the new moon. It's the day of the first observed new crescent that is the new moon. And there is a very strong argument that can be made for that. Now, the question that I had for him, and the question I have for anybody that wants to raise this question, if you really have the time or the energy to do it, is how do you prove from the Bible that, quote, the new moon, end quote, is the day of the conjunction, or that it is the day of the first observed new crescent? What scripture will you turn to? Will it be in Genesis, or Exodus, or Leviticus, or Numbers, or Deuteronomy? Where will you go? It's not there. It's just not there. There is nothing in the Bible to tell you that the new moon is either the one or the other, and there is a reasonable case that can be made for either one. Okay? How then do you decide? Well, you sit down and you weigh up all the evidence that's on the thing. You think, well, here's what I think is probably the way it ought to be done. I would consider, for example, now, let's supposing we're trying to take the gospel of the truth of God to a very primitive people. Now, you know, you get back, you're talking to a bunch of Bantu over in southeastern Africa, and you're trying to explain to them about Jesus Christ and about God and so forth. You know, a lot of our rather technical discussions of doctrine and theology are not going to be of very much value. They're just not going to get it, are they? They're not going to grasp it. Where would you start with people like that? How would you explain to them what they had to do, what God expected of them? Well, you can start with the Ten Commandments. That's something they can begin to deal with. You know, there's some law that you can show them. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not steal. And you can work your way through that. But you know, when it comes down to the place, sooner or later with people like that, you have got to develop a set of rules. They need a ritual. They need a ceremony. They need to be able to do it exactly this way with no variations from it. Because you give them any shot at variations at all, and they'll be worshiping the sun, the moon, the stars, fire, earth, water, you name whatever it is, because these people haven't gotten away from a lot of that yet. When you're dealing with a very primitive people, you've got to be pretty simple. Now, how are you going to explain to these primitive people down there, how are you going to explain to them how they determine the day of the conjunction? Now, let me ask you this. Do you know, let's take away your computers and your calculators, let's take away your watch, you use a sundial if you must. I want you to tell me how you would go about establishing the day of the conjunction for the year, for every month of the year of 1993. I'd be very surprised if there's anybody in the room that could do it. And no almanacs, no tables. You've got to go outside and go on what you can see and calculate those things. It'll take you a long time to collect the data to even get close. You're going to have to figure out for yourself the periodicity of the moon. How long does it actually take it to do what it does? And how many days are involved? And figure out that sometimes it's 29 and sometimes it's 30, and the very fine proportion between 29 and 30-day months. It takes you a long time to figure that out. Now, on the other hand, I could come to you if you were one of those East African natives, and I could say to you, now, we watch the moon in the sky, and when you see that first new crescent right after sundown, not before, that is the new moon. Well, why not before? Because I said so. There comes a place in the calendar where you are left with nothing else except because I said so, with a primitive people. Because you're not going to get anywhere trying to explain to them all of the nuances of new moons and how many parts the hour is broken up into and moads of Tishri and all that garbage. You can't get anywhere with that. But you can tell them that whenever they go out and they see the first crescent in the sky right after the sun has gone over the horizon, that's the first day of the month. Now we can start counting months, and this is going to be the first month of the year to you, and so on and so forth. Hey, they can work with that. But you realize what I've done? I've arrived at what I've arrived at through a system of logic and inference. Not by taking you to a scripture that says, it is done this way, haven't I? The truth of the matter is that somewhere, somehow, someone has got to make those decisions. Wherever two or three of you are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose upon earth shall be loosed in heaven. It's why, in fact, the Apostle Paul, talking about the Jews, he says, what advantage do the Jews have? He says, much in every way, chiefly because unto them were committed the oracles of God. The word oracles means simply utterances. This is not the word Paul uses elsewhere for the law or the Old Testament or the Torah or any of those things. What he is talking about here, without any question really, is the oral law. Down through generations, God spoke to the Jews that is to the Israelites, because the priest had a Urim and Thummim on. And they could go to this man and ask questions, and they got yes or no decisions on a broad variety of questions that they could ask. And so they developed up over a long period of time not merely the written law, which you and I have got, but the oral law. Now, for us, the oral law can never have the authority of the written law because, you never know exactly, well, how in the world has this thing been changed, moved, played with, and the question about the calendar is one of the best ones you could go to show that there is an enormous amount of uncertainty in it. But you know what's beautiful about it? The uncertainty doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Because God said, whatsoever you bind upon earth shall be bound in heaven, whatsoever you loose upon earth shall be loosed in heaven. The important thing is that you get into that calendar, and once you're into that calendar, once the calendar is sanctified, these days are holy. Now, I have discussed that question at some length in an article entitled, Why We Use the Hebrew Calendar, and I won't go further with it today, but I think it is important for us to understand that this comes about purely as a result of the responsibility that descends upon the ministry to evaluate certain questions and decide what we're all going to do. Otherwise, if we left it every one of us, we would have political parties in the church, and some of us would be keeping the Passover one day. There'd be years when we'd be a month off in keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, and we would splinter and go 100 different directions. How do I know that? Well, because it's already happened. There were people keeping the Feast of Tabernacles, started 2 days before we did, they ended 2 days before we did this year. There were people who were a month off from us in keeping the Feast of Tabernacles this year, and so on it goes. They are organizational units, as it were, or administrative units of the Church of God. And they have made certain decisions to go and do these things this way. And if they're faithful to God, and they honor God in what they're doing, God, I'm sure, will bless them in what they do. But we have made decisions to do this the way that we're going to do it, and we will carry on with what we're doing. All of us will try our best to serve God. The important thing is that we don't go picking or sniping at one another in the process. The administrative church depends in large degree upon leadership, relationships, the gifts that people have, goals that are set, commissions that are given. Jesus called the Apostle Paul apart from the existing administration of the church and sent him out to do a job. And so off he went, assuming that he knew what he was doing and assuming that he was supposed to be doing what he was doing. And indeed, the results of it, I think, are very clear to us as time went on. What is the work of the local church? I talked about the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn, and I've talked about the church organization or the administered church. What about the local church? The local church assembles for four main reasons. First of all, to assemble. I guess that would be the fifth one, but it's kind of redundant to say that, in the sense that we are not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together and that the Sabbath is a commanded assembly. So we assemble for that reason. We assemble for four reasons in addition to that. The first is worship. And by that I mean joint worship, the shared worship that we have together when we sing and when we pray together, oftentimes lifting up our voice in praise of God, and other times lifting up our voice in prayer for our brothers and our sisters and the troubles and pains that they have in their life. The second reason the local church exists is for edification. That's to teach. That's what I'm doing right here and right now. The third reason is fellowship. You find that the sort of general expression for that, apart from the word fellowship itself, is the breaking of bread that you find so commonly mentioned in the earliest church. Because they would go to the temple for prayer and for worship. And then they would return to their house church, as it were, for fellowship, to break bread. The fact that we share a meal together, or that we even share coffee and cookies together, all of this is a communal activity. It's a time of fellowship when we talk to one another, and we find out about one another. We get to know one another. We get to bond with one another, to care about one another, to share experiences together. All of this is a part of the process of fellowship. The fourth reason a local church exists is for service. Classic example of this was Acts the 6th chapter, when one set of widows was being neglected in the daily administration. And so they had to adjust their administration in order to take care of those people. Service. There are many things that we would have to do or find to do in the local church. You find another illustration in the New Testament that there was a famine that was coming up in Jerusalem and Judea. And all the churches up in Asia Minor and all over into Greece were busy getting ready for it. Paul wrote a letter to the Corinthians. He says, now I want you to, on the first day of the week, I want you to lay by you in store the stuff so that when I come by, I can pick it up and take it off. I don't want you to have to go out in the field after I get there. We don't have time for that. So the church had to organize itself systematically to take care of the collection of, the passage of, the movement of, and the distribution of an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem. And it took an organizational structure and administration, which they went on to take care of. Now, the first two of these, worship and edification, are really the very easiest of the lot. You come to church, you sing, you say amen at the end of the prayer, and you listen dutifully to the sermon or sermonette or Bible study that is given to you. The last two of these, fellowship and service, are the ones that you cannot afford to take for granted. Because here we are at the foundation and the building blocks, the smallest particles, actually, of the building of a church as an effective organization, so that we go all the way back to Matthew 28, 19, and 20. Make disciples, baptize them, and teach them. Right at the very root of it all, the thing that keeps us together, keeps us harmonious, keeps us working together, and keeps us effective is fellowship and service. Now, service is something we all do at a very personal level. You know, if you go next door when your next door neighbor has lost her husband, and you go take a dish of food to this lady, you have done something at a very personal level. What I'm talking about here, though, is what the church does, not what you do. That there is a need for concerted activity in forms of service that has to do with taking care of one another, those of the household of faith, that are very, very important in the process not only of helping the people, but in bonding us together as a team who are willing to work and work together and accomplish things together, and we learn to like one another, to love one another, and to be able to be effective in service. How many ways are there to do this? My, those are only limited by your imagination and the things that you might be able to do. Actually, preaching can get you into a whole lot of trouble. I would say most of the difficulties that we have in the CGI across the country have arisen in one way or another out of preaching. Somebody who wanted to preach who couldn't, somebody who did preach who shouldn't have, somebody who preached who didn't know what he was talking about, someone who preached and stepped on somebody's toes and made somebody mad. It just goes on and on and on. James said, look, brethren, don't get in a hurry to rush in to be teachers. We teachers will be judged with special strictness. It's a tough business, and not just everybody should be doing it. But you know, while preaching can get you into trouble, fellowship and service always work. They always work. The fact that people are together, that they share together, which is what fellowship really does mean, and that they serve together, makes all the difference in the world. Now, across the country, listening to this on tape, there will be a number of people the coming week who will not have a minister. And they kind of may feel sorry for themselves because they don't have a minister. Well, you know, in a sense, the only thing missing from your church service is edification. Or is it? Because this tape cassette or this videotape that you're watching are edification. Edification nowadays, you can get so edified you don't have any time for anything else. You can be edified ironing the clothes, you can be edified driving your car to work. Some people even get edified while they're working, to the extent that they may not be paying attention to what they're doing on the job. I mean, tapes, cassettes, we've got more stuff to be edified with. But you know, we don't have many chances and many opportunities for fellowship and for service. It is these things that I feel the local church needs to give its primary attention to, exert its efforts toward, and make sacrifices to achieve. Because it's in these areas that the real strength of the local church is built. And it's out of that strength that the General Assembly and Church of the Firstborn is built.